Hello and welcome back. Good to see you. And I hope you're going to thoroughly enjoy this little adventure into the whole political arena, because that's where we're at the particular moment. And some amazing stuff coming up. But before we go straight to the Rudd concession, which I have to confess is where I want to go because it was such a contentious particular piece of paper. But let's just quickly look at what was happening in Zululand, because it was pretty chaotic down there too. So after Mzilikazi, Zwanganaba and Lobengula all broke away from Chaka at various times, he was left quite substantially lessened. And when his mother died, he really went berserk and was killing people left, right and centre because they didn't grieve enough. So let's just look at his legacy. He formed 100 chiefdoms into one Zulu nation, but in the process probably killed about 100,000 people. Estimates only, all oral history, just a bit of an idea, but an extraordinary man, no question of that. Anyway, the time came when his brother Dingaan decided it was time to dispatch him because he was just being too cruel, and as he was killing them in 1828, Chaka managed to say, "You kill me thinking you will rule, but you won't, because the swallows will." The swallows being the white people, because they build their houses of mud. And as he was dying, he said, "You will come to an end through killing each other." Nothing could have been more prophetic about what was about to happen, because Dingaan inherited the throne for a while. He made peace with the British. He wanted to trade. He would protect the traders, and he desired a missionary. Bizarre. Desired a missionary. Okay. And I suddenly thought, oh yeah, I remember. I wrote a bit about that because it was quite intriguing stuff. So I went and looked back on it and look. The kings knew they were at a disadvantage because they couldn't read or write, which was why, of course, there was a mission at Inyati, which was near Mzilikazi's capital, and there was a mission at Hope Fountain, which was near Lobengula's capital. Makes sense. So Dingaan desired a missionary as well. They wanted their people to learn and interpret for them so that they could understand the minds of the white man. Staff at the missions would teach the 3 R's as well as Christianity. And having a mission nearby meant that some, particularly the sons of the chief, could learn. Very much a case of know your enemy. Very wise, I would suggest. Anyway, Dingaan loosened the reins a bit. Warriors were allowed to marry, which they hadn't been allowed to do under Chaka. The place became generally more settled, but he traded heavily in guns. And 10 years later, Piet Retief, an Afrikaner, landed near Durban, and he wrote a letter requesting a piece of land from Dingaan. Dingaan didn't seem adverse to it. He certainly understood what he was talking about, signed a piece of paper, invited Piet Retief and his contingent up to make big celebrations, and murdered them all. So there was not long before there was great retribution from Pretorius, who was camped just a bit further down the track, and Pretorius said, "Oh, we can't have this happening," so off he went, and this hideous battle of Blood River came about, where 10,000 Zulus took on Pretorius and the Afrikaners, and 3,000 Zulus died on the spot. So his son Mpande then took over the kingship, but Mpande was never really keen on being king. He was not a fighter, and he never really had a great wife. So it was never determined which of his sons was going to be king. So big enmity between Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi. And Mpande actually rather favoured Mbuyazi rather than Cetshwayo. Anyway, when he died, Cetshwayo became king, and he was banished, and then he was reinstated for various things, and suddenly in 1884 he died mysteriously of poisoning, which then left Dinizulu, who was only 15 years old at that time, and literally the whole Zulu kingdom totally just disintegrated, because there was nobody really to look after it, and the British had made so many inroads to it anyway. So in 1887 the British annexed Zululand as a colony. And then after a while, that was absorbed into Natal, hence the KwaZulu-Natal that we know today. But they were much too busy, all those tribes, fighting each other and trying to back or set Boers off against British and vice versa. So they never actually really got ahead after Chaka's day. And the Matabele never had that sort of problem because they never had really any tribes that caused many problems, except for the Makalolo when Mzilikazi was trying to go up to the Vic Falls. But otherwise, pretty easy for them. So let's get on now to the right concession. And I think I'm going to be a bit indulgent and read just bits from The Horns, the book that I wrote last year, because using the 4 characters who all come from such different perspectives, and it just kind of argues it through much better than my trying to talk it to you. So Angus is a native commissioner, as he was in those days, so I'll take the characters as we go past. Angus was watching their faces. He'd given each of them a copy of the Red Concession to read. He was fascinated by their expressions as they reached the end of it. He waited till they'd all finished, and then he said, "It was signed in the same way of all Lobengula's letters and treaties, with his X, the elephant seal. There was validation by missionary Charles Helm and other co-signatories underneath that. Impressions first. Temba? Well, I have to say it is the most complex document to try and explain to the Amandebele people at that time. I can hardly understand it, and I'm in my final few weeks of A-levels. It's ridiculous." Carol was bemused. She'd never seen Temba so worked up before. "From the little I know about contracts, this one does the right thing, sort of. It identifies what the grantor, that is Lobengula, wants out of the deal and the way he would like it to be delivered. Then it identifies what he's giving away, and then it adds a provision that if the conditions demanded by the grantor are not met by the grantee, that's a RUD, the grant conditions would cease." He looked at Angus in amazement. "But it is so lacking in detail." Carol? "Well, I have for the first time understood why Lobengula wanted things that seemed strange at first hearing. People ridicule this concession, saying things like, what would an uneducated man like Lobengula want with all that money and those rifles and ammunition and a steamboat on the Zambezi, a gunship no less? I've never been able to answer it before, but I think I can now." She looked meaningfully at Jabu. The Martini Henry was the most suitable weapon for this type of warfare. The steamboat gunship meant he must have decided that if or when the Matabele had to move across the Zambezi to the Batoka lands, the steamboat gunship would help them defend the big river border much more effectively. Angus laughed. An unexpected fallout from that agreed payment of guns was that Sir Sidney Shippard, who was resident commissioner of Bechuanaland, had to spend many hours reassuring King Khama that the issue of guns to the Matabele would have no impact on Bechuanaland. As you know, King Khama hated the Matabele. The last thing he wanted was to have them armed with Martini Henry rifles. He was reassured that as Bechuanaland was now a protectorate of the United Kingdom, the country would be defended by Her Majesty's forces, should that ever happen. "Yes, that makes sense. Khama would have been pretty anxious." Pruden was the next in the circle. "But from a business point of view, as money became more desirable and necessary to achieve what King Lobengula needed, then it was clever of him to say he would not be paid on a lunar month basis, or he would be paid on a lunar month basis, not a calendar month. That way he gets 13 payments every year. Aye, if they couldn't supply the boat, he'd get a one-off payment as well. Good business." "Well, I'd like to add my little bit here." Lovely little character called Aidan. He was an Irishman. He just kind of got himself into the story somehow. "Even though I know precious little about it, this sentence clarifies something for me. It assigns jointly and severally the complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals situated and contained in my kingdoms, principalities, and dominions. Am I going mad, or did he only give away the right to dig for gold and other minerals? You're not going mad, Aidan. That's exactly what was given away in the concession. Nothing else. Jabu couldn't wait to get his word in. Ah, but it was not what was written that mattered. It was what was not written. No question whatsoever that that was the problem with the concession. We can explore that just a little bit more. How did it all happen? Well, Rhodes had asked Rudd and a man called Maguire, who was a contemporary of Rhodes at Oxford and who was a barrister in London, although he'd actually never practiced law because he was currently an MP. And the third member of the trio was Matabele Thompson, who knew the Matabeles well and spoke the language, etc., and was accorded the title of Matabele Thompson. And the only access you could get to Lobengula at that time, because he was so fed up with all these hundreds of people constantly trying to get concessions and badgering him for things, was through the missionary Charles Helm. And Helm writes that he heard about what Rudd was on about, and he thought, well, I think it's worth trying to see if I can get to see Lobengula and get him to talk to these people. He was very reluctant to just let anybody go and see him because there was just so many hundreds of them. So he went to see the king, and the king said, yes, that's fine. I'm happy to see you in 10 days' time. So you can tell me the story then. After 10 days, Helm went back, and he outlined what the Rudd concession was asking for. Another 10 days, I want to think. So after another 10 days, he came back with a few more answers and a few more questions. Next week. And then in that week, Rudd found that the man who was going to interpret for him was ill with smallpox and was going to be unable to do it. So he asked Helm if he would do it. Helm was really unhappy because he didn't like getting involved in anything political. And he writes in his journal back to the London Missionary Society, as they could get no one to interpret, they came to me and asked me to interpret for them. I'd rather have had nothing to do with gold concessions and told the chief so. But not thinking that harm could come from simply interpreting, I consented, and the chief said he was glad that I should do so, and he perfectly understood I had nothing more to do with it. So on that basis, Helm was able to get an audience with the king, and this time it was to explain the whole thing in detail to the king and 100 of his indunas. And this was a meeting which took the whole day. Helm described every possible aspect of what was being asked by telling and repeating, stopping the meeting, going off to seek assurances and clarification from Rudd, going back to answer more questions, telling again, repeating again, seeking more assurances, reporting back to Lobengula. It lasted the whole day, with 100 indunas debating whether or not they should go for this. They were tempted, of course, because it had come from Rhodes and it had come from the British South Africa Company. And those were big names. And also there was this extraordinary but very tangible link between the royalty of the Matabele kings and the Zulus and other African kings and Queen Victoria. She was their contemporary, and she was extraordinary in the way she dealt with them, because when they came to see her, she was intrigued by them, wanted to know all about them, and opened up the affairs of state for each of them. So there was this funny hidden link behind it all. Anyway, so there'd already been about 3 weeks of negotiations going on, and after the whole day with the indunas, then Lobengula said, "I will meet your friends in 3 days' time." So Rudd and Maguire and Thompson were thrilled. Wonderful, 3 days. Off they go. Lobengula would not talk business. All he wanted to do was to meet them. So they went away frustrated again. Another week. And this time they met with 100 Indunas. This was never taken lightly. Never taken lightly. It's too easy to just diminish Lobengula and said he just gave away his country. He certainly did not. He thought every single possible bit about what he needed to do, what was right for his people, in the face of incredible pressure. Temba said, "If I was Lobengula and I had had years of fending off concession seekers, I would be really keen to try and get this right. I have never believed Lobengula was naive enough to be taken in by this concession. He was, as we now know, a man way beyond his time, and quite clever enough to know that any concession from Rhodes or the Chartered Company had to be taken seriously. That's why he called the Indabas." So the final Indaba came, and they had another huge full-day meeting. Some people said half a day, some people said 2 days. It was one of those. Then the king met with his top Nduna, Loche and Matabele Thompson, and they spent all day nutting out the finer details. And the king turned to Loche and said, "What would you do?" Loche said, "I would sign." And it was agreed to be signed. 6:30 a.m. the next morning, Rudd, Maguire and Thompson arrived for the signing, and so did 100 headmen. So the whole thing was done in front of all these people. It had taken 6 weeks of debate, and the Matabele recognised it as a critical event. Understandably, Lobengula was anxious. After more repetitions to the full Indaba of everything written in that document, punctuated by Helm seeking more verbal assurances from Rudd before any signatures were made, consensus was eventually reached. It had taken 6 weeks. Aidan, of course, my little friend Aidan, he said, "Well," he said, "there's still a question hanging in the air. Was the British government in cahoots with the company? That's the unspoken bit, the unanswered bit, and I'd lay my bets on it." You can see what a great character he was. He kind of pinpointed, put the flashlight right in where it needed to be on occasions. So now we had a signed document. A signed document had to be got down to the British in Cape Town. Thompson heard Loche, a couple of weeks later, was suddenly murdered by the king. There was a bit of an uproar, which we'll go into next week, following the signing of the Rudd Commission. Thompson panicked. He buried the document in the pumpkin gourd with a little seed corn, so that in the event of his death, the growing corn would reveal its position to his Zulu servant Charlie. He was afraid someone might get hold of it and tear it up. Thompson also wrote a letter back to his family in England. "After riding for hours in the blazing sun, I had to make a hat by tying 4 knots in my handkerchief and stuffing it with grass. Towards sundown, I found myself in unknown country, in the middle of the Kalahari Desert." "May I read that, Mr. Davidson?" Jabu asked. He found himself acting out the part with exaggerated hand gestures. "I had neither food nor water, and I might be attacked by lions. I tied my horse, climbed into a tree, and there I spent the night. The next day, I rose until the horse knocked up, and then I walked, and I walked, and I ran, and I covered 30 or 40 miles. My tongue became swollen, and towards evening stuck out of my mouth. My eyes were so bloodshot I could scarcely see, and my breath was short. I met some Makalaka natives cooking a pot of mealies, and in exchange for my pocket knife, I bought some to eat. Luckily, I came upon a trader with a mule wagon, whereupon I met up with Jameson, who urged me to return to Matabeleland to retrieve the document. But he was too frightened. Apart from a little literary license there, Jabu, and dramatics quite suitable for the stage, the last thing poor old Thompson would have wanted would have been to return to Matabeleland. Carol, your turn. Well, mine says that Rudd left immediately for the south with the concession in his pocket and a request that he'd bring up his big brother Rhodes next time. Rudd apparently had the most terrible journey, for the waterholes across the Bechuana Desert were dried up at that time of the year, and rains were later than usual in breaking. Had it not been for the help of some kindly Bechuanas who found him lying unconscious and gave him water from a buried ostrich egg, neither he nor the document would ever have been heard of again. Temba interrupted. Well, that's wrong for a start. There wouldn't have been Bechuanas. It would have been Bushmen, because they are the ones who survive in the desert by burying ostrich eggs for their water. Carol continued, I haven't quite finished yet. Rudd said he'd hidden the precious concession in an ant-bear hole. Prune didn't want to be left out. In that report that we read from Helm, he said he had a copy of the Rudd concession, and he produced it for the king when asked to repeat what it said. And he did so again once the original was returned, so that Lobengula could compare them. Carol chimed in, but my note says one of John Moffat's biographers said it was Moffat who'd been given a copy of the document. Oh, boy, you don't know what to believe. No, but the threads are there. Somebody, or two somebodies, were given a copy of the concession. The original document was hidden in a pumpkin gourd by somebody, or an ant-bear hole by somebody else. And to cap it all, Jabu said scornfully, two stupid people tried to cross the Bechuanaland Desert in October, the hottest month of the year, before the rains come. Crazy. It was crazy. So you can see that even before it caused a storm, the Rudd concession had caused a storm. And it was enormous. And it all revolved around 10 men. And it all revolved around one particular clause. And the whole world at that time was determined to sink it. And that's next week's program. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's all a bit detailed, a bit muddled, but I hope you managed to follow the thread. See you again, same time, next week. Bye.